What happens when a man builds a world so complete, so persuasive, that even he can no longer distinguish where the invention ends and he begins? If you are joining us for this journey, we are grateful for your time, and if you would consider subscribing, you would help us reach our goal of 1,000, a small gesture that allows these stories to continue being told. Now, let us proceed. There is a road in Bedford, New York, that few have reason to travel. It winds through old forests, past stone walls assembled 2 centuries ago by hands long forgotten. The estates here do not announce themselves. Wealth, in this territory, prefers silence. But one property, hidden behind hundreds of acres of cultivated wilderness, tells a different story. It is a story about something more elusive than money. It is a story about the architecture of self. The year is 1995, October. The leaves have turned, and the light carries that particular amber quality of northeastern autumns. Soft, elegiac, already mourning the summer it replaced. On this evening, a dinner is being prepared in the main house of what its owner calls the Double RL Ranch. The name itself is a provocation, a Western gesture transplanted to land once held by Dutch patroons and English settlers. The table is set with antique silver, sourced from estate sales across 3 continents. The chairs are mismatched, deliberately so. Nothing here is accidental. Nothing here is what it first appears. The man who owns this property was not born to it. He was not born to anything resembling it. Ralph Lauren, though that was not always his name, grew up in a Bronx tenement, the son of Jewish immigrants from Belarus. His father painted houses. The family shared small rooms. The world of Bedford, of country estates and riding stables, existed only in the movies he watched as a boy, in magazine photographs he could not afford. But here now he sits at the head of a table that might have belonged to a railroad baron, in a house suggesting 5 generations of American aristocracy. The metamorphosis is complete, or rather it has been complete for so long that the word no longer applies. There is no before, there is only this. The property spans more than 250 acres. It includes multiple residences, barns weathered to the exact shade suggesting noble decay, fences appearing to have stood for a century, though installed a decade prior. There are horses, always horses, because horses signify a particular relationship to land, to leisure, to the kind of time only the wealthy possess. Every surface has been aged, made to carry the weight of memory. But whose memory? The land itself holds no connection to the aesthetic that now defines it. This is the question hovering over Bedford, like morning fog that refuses to burn away. Whose past is being performed here? Whose nostalgia is this? By 1995, Ralph Lauren had become one of the wealthiest men in American fashion. His company generated billions. His face appeared in his own advertisements, an unusual choice at the time, presenting himself as the embodiment of the lifestyle he sold. But the relationship between man and brand had grown so intertwined that observers wondered which came first. Did he create Polo Ralph Lauren in his image, or did the brand slowly create him? The Bedford estate offered no answers. Journalists who visited described feeling as though they had stepped into a living catalogue, a 3-dimensional advertisement containing an actual family. The children rode horses through fields that appeared in campaigns. The antiques were identical to those photographed for spreads. The boundary between residence and set had been erased so thoroughly that the distinction seemed naive. Some found this admirable. Commitment, consistency, the ultimate brand integrity. Others found it quietly unsettling. Perhaps it was the perfection. Real homes contain imperfections, objects kept for sentiment rather than beauty, the accidents of actual living. Bedford permitted no such accidents. Every worn leather chair, every faded photograph had been chosen, arranged, approved. The staff understood their roles. Groundskeepers maintained the property to appear unmaintained. Interiors were adjusted seasonally, though designed to seem unchanged. The illusion demanded more labor than honest presentation would have required. And at the center sat a man who had remade himself so completely that the original self, Ralph Lifshitz of the Bronx, son of a house painter, had become almost theoretical. He existed in documents, in birth records, but not here, in Bedford. Here there was only Ralph Lauren, a name chosen for its particular music, its suggestion of elegance filtered through American possibility. The dinner concludes. The guests depart. The house settles into its evening silence, and somewhere in those 250 acres, the border between a man and his invention dissolves once more into darkness. To understand Bedford, one must first understand the Bronx. Not the Bronx of later decades, not the Bronx of urban decay and popular mythology, but the Bronx of the 1940s and 50s, a place of immigrant strivers, of families who had fled pogroms and poverty, who carried with them the particular ambition of those who have seen the alternative to success. Ralph Lifshitz was born in 1939, the youngest of 4 children. His parents, Frank and Frida, had arrived from Belarus, with nothing but the determination common to their generation. Frank found work as a house painter. The family lived in a modest apartment in the Mosholu Parkway section, a neighborhood of working-class Jews and Italians, of small aspirations and smaller rooms. There was no disgrace in this life, but there was also no romance. It was functional. It was survival dressed in weekday clothes. But young Ralph possessed something that would prove more valuable than any inheritance: an eye. He noticed things. He noticed the way certain men carried themselves, the way fabric draped on particular shoulders, the way a well-chosen tie could suggest an entire world of privilege and ease. He watched films obsessively, studying the wardrobes of Cary Grant, of Fred Astaire, of men who seemed to have been born into elegance. He understood even then that clothing was not merely covering. It was declaration. It was aspiration made visible. His brother Jerry shared this fascination. Together they would save money to buy clothes far beyond their station, pieces that announced a future they had not yet earned. The neighborhood boys noticed. Some mocked, others envied. Ralph paid little attention to either response. He was already constructing something in his mind, a vision of himself that had nothing to do with the Bronx, with house painters, with the accumulated modesty of immigrant life. The name change came in 1958. Ralph Lifshitz became Ralph Lauren. The reasons were practical. Lifshitz invited ridicule, carried associations he wished to shed. But the transformation was also symbolic. He was not merely changing a name, he was changing a narrative. The new surname suggested France, suggested aristocracy, suggested a lineage unconnected to tenements and cramped apartments. It was his first act of deliberate invention, and it would not be his last. He did not attend fashion school. He did not apprentice with established designers. Instead, he worked as a salesman at Brooks Brothers, absorbing the codes of American preppy style, learning the vocabulary of old money, even as he stood behind a counter serving it. He studied his customers with the attention of an anthropologist. He noted what they bought, how they wore it, what signals they intended to send. He was conducting research for a project that did not yet have a name. In 1967, he launched a line of wide neckties. The fashion world had been moving toward narrow, understated accessories, but Lauren sensed a countercurrent, a desire for something bolder, more expressive. He was correct. The ties sold. More importantly, They established a principle that would define his career. He was not following trends. He was creating moods. The Polo label emerged shortly after. The name was significant. Polo was a sport of aristocrats, of landed gentry, of men who owned horses and estates and time. By attaching this word to his clothing, Lauren was selling not fabric, but fantasy. Every customer who purchased a polo shirt was buying admission to a world that did not technically exist. An imagined America of country clubs and sailing regattas and summer homes passed down through generations. The genius lay in the specificity of the illusion. Lauren did not offer generic luxury. He offered a particular kind of luxury, rooted in Anglo-American tradition, in the aesthetic of the Eastern establishment, in the visual language of families whose wealth was old enough to seem natural. He understood that new money always seeks the appearance of old money, that the American dream includes the dream of pretending the dream was never necessary. By the mid-70s, Polo Ralph Lauren had become a phenomenon. The company expanded into women's wear, into home furnishings, into fragrances. Each extension maintained the same coherent vision, a world of burnished wood and leather-bound books, of dogs sleeping before fireplaces, of rooms that smelled of history. The advertisements became famous for their narrative quality. They did not simply display products. They told stories, implied generations, suggested that purchasing a sweater meant inheriting a legacy. And somewhere in this expansion, Ralph Lauren began to disappear into his creation. The line between designer and design grew thin, then invisible. He dressed as his customers wished to dress. He acquired the possessions his catalogs displayed. He became, in effect, his own best advertisement, a living proof that the fantasy could be achieved, that transformation was possible, that America still permitted the invention of self. Bedford waited. The estate that would complete this transformation had not yet been purchased, but the foundation had been laid. The man who would soon own 250 acres of Westchester County had already built something more impressive, a complete American mythology, available for purchase, one garment at a time. The property came to him in the early 1980s. 250 acres of Westchester County, an hour north of Manhattan, in a township where the families had names that appeared on street signs and hospital wings. Bedford was not merely wealthy, it was old wealthy, which in America means something different than wealth alone. It means discretion. It means gates without ostentation. It means the kind of silence that only generations of security can produce. Ralph Lauren arrived in this territory as an outsider, though by then his fortune exceeded that of many established residents. He had money. What he lacked was time, the accumulated decades of belonging, the patina of inheritance, the casual assumption that one's presence required no explanation. In Bedford, new arrivals were noted, assessed, and remembered. The community did not exclude openly. It simply waited to see if newcomers understood the local dialect of understatement. Lauren understood. He had spent his career studying exactly this language, translating it into products that could be purchased by those who had not been born speaking it. But now he faced a different challenge. He was not selling the fantasy. He was attempting to live it. The estate would be his proof, his three-dimensional argument, that transformation was complete. The original structures on the property were unremarkable. Functional buildings that served agricultural purposes, houses that spoke of practical New England restraint rather than aristocratic grandeur. This would not do. Lauren began a renovation that would continue for years, a systematic reimagining of the land itself. He brought in architects, designers, and artisans, but the vision remained entirely his own. Every decision passed through his eye. that same eye that had noticed fabric and posture in the Bronx decades earlier. The main residence emerged as a study in controlled nostalgia. It suggested a ranch house, but not any ranch that had actually existed. It evoked the American West as filtered through Hollywood, through the mythology of open spaces and rugged individualism, yet transplanted to the manicured forests of the Northeast. The contradiction was intentional. Loren was not recreating history. He was improving upon it, assembling a past more beautiful than any that had actually occurred. Barns were constructed and then aged, their wood treated to suggest decades of weather and use. Stone walls were built using techniques that mimicked colonial craftsmanship. Fences appeared weathered from their first day of installation. The property accumulated objects, antique weather vanes, vintage farm equipment, collections of Native American artifacts, each piece selected not for personal meaning, but for visual contribution to the overall narrative. The estate was being curated rather than lived in, though the Lorens did indeed live there, moving through rooms arranged like museum displays. The horses arrived, of course. A property of this nature required horses, required the particular relationship between human and animal that suggested landed tradition. Stables were built to house them, structures as carefully designed as the residences themselves. The animals became part of the composition, their presence in fields completing a picture that might have illustrated a magazine feature on country living, which in fact it frequently did. Journalists who received invitations to Bedford returned with descriptions that blurred the line between reporting and advertisement. They wrote of warmth and authenticity, of a family that had created something genuine in an age of artifice. Few noted the contradiction embedded in these assessments. The authenticity they praised was itself a construction, a performance so thorough that it had become invisible. The Lorens were not pretending to live this way, they were living this way, but the way itself had been designed, planned, and executed with the precision of a theatrical production. Ricky Loren, his wife since 1964, participated fully in this creation. She appeared in photographs as the ideal companion to such an existence. Blonde, elegant, at ease among horses and antiques. Their children grew up within the fantasy, attending the schools appropriate to Bedford families, learning to ride, absorbing the codes of the world their father had built around them. Whether they experienced this as privilege or as pressure remains unknown. The family maintained its privacy with the same discipline it applied to aesthetics. By the late 80s, the Bedford estate had achieved its intended effect. It was no longer possible to see Ralph Lauren as a designer who had adopted an aristocratic lifestyle. He had become indistinguishable from it. The man and the brand had merged into a single entity, and the property served as physical evidence of this fusion. Visitors could not say where commerce ended and personal life began, because that boundary had been deliberately erased. The question of authenticity, what it meant, whether it mattered, hovered over Bedford, like the morning mist that rose from its carefully maintained fields. But no one in the family appeared interested in answering it. Perhaps by then, the question itself had ceased to have meaning. The 1990s brought expansion beyond anything the fashion industry had witnessed. Polo Ralph Lauren was no longer merely a clothing company. It had become a lifestyle conglomerate, a purveyor of complete environments. One could furnish an entire existence through the brand, from the sheets on which one slept, to the paint on one's walls, from the towels in the bathroom, to the dishes on the dinner table. The vision that had begun with wide neckties now encompassed the totality of domestic life. The flagship store on Madison Avenue opened in 1986, occupying the Rhinelander Mansion, a building that seemed to have been designed specifically to house the Lauren mythology. Here was old New York architecture, repurposed to sell new American dreams. Customers wandered through rooms arranged as though a wealthy family had simply stepped out for the afternoon, leaving behind their possessions for inspection and purchase. The retail experience itself became theatrical, a journey through aspiration rather than a simple transaction. But expansion carries its own dangers. The larger an empire grows, the more difficult it becomes to maintain the illusion of intimacy that luxury requires. Ralph Lauren faced a particular challenge. His brand promised authenticity, connection to genuine tradition, escape from mass-produced modernity. Yet fulfilling the demand for these products required precisely the mass production the brand implicitly criticized. Factories in Asia assembled garments bearing the polo player logo. Licensing agreements multiplied the brand across product categories, far removed from Lauren's original vision. The tension remained largely invisible to consumers. They purchased the dream without examining its manufacture. But within the company, questions emerged. How much growth was compatible with the brand's essential promise? At what point did ubiquity undermine exclusivity? These were not merely business concerns. They touched the philosophical foundation of everything Lauren had built. Bedford offered refuge from such questions. The estate existed outside commercial logic, a place where the fantasy required no justification beyond its own beauty. Lauren retreated there with increasing frequency, spending weekends among his horses and antiques, walking grounds that represented the purest expression of his vision. Here, at least, no compromises had been made. Every detail remained under his control. The family had settled into its roles. David, the eldest son, joined the company, learning the business that would eventually pass to the next generation. Andrew and Dylan, the younger children, pursued their own paths while remaining connected to the family enterprise. Ricky continued to embody the feminine ideal of the brand, her presence in photographs suggesting that the Lauren lifestyle was not merely achievable but sustainable across decades of marriage. They presented collectively an image of dynasty, American royalty built not on birth, but on taste. Yet even dynasties face mortality. In 1987, Ralph Lauren underwent treatment for a benign brain tumor. The episode was handled with characteristic discretion, acknowledged publicly only after successful recovery. But it introduced a shadow into the Bedford idyll, a reminder that the man who had built this world would not inhabit it forever. The question of legacy, always implicit in the brand's obsession with heritage, became personal. What would survive? The company, presumably, with its billions in revenue and global recognition. The properties passed to heirs who would maintain or modify them according to their own visions. But what of the animating spirit, the particular eye that had seen possibilities invisible to others? Could that be inherited, or would it disappear with its creator? Lauren responded to mortality as he had responded to every challenge, through creation. The 90s saw the launch of new lines, new stores, new extensions of the brand into territories previously unexplored. He designed costumes for films, dressed characters who would carry his aesthetic into cinematic permanence. He accumulated properties beyond Bedford, a ranch in Colorado, an estate in Jamaica, an apartment in Manhattan that occupied an entire floor. Each acquisition added to the physical evidence of transformation, the material proof that a boy from the Bronx had become something unprecedented. The collections grew. Vintage automobiles, dozens of them, representing the mechanical elegance of earlier eras. Western artifacts gathered from dealers across the country. Art, selected not by curators, but by the same eye that chose fabrics and furniture. The objects accumulated around him like a fortress, beautiful things arranged in beautiful spaces, a world entirely of his own making. And at the center of this accumulation, the man himself grew older, his hair whitening, his face weathering into the distinguished contours that his brand had always promised its customers. He was becoming, finally, what he had always sold, the image of American aristocracy, aged into apparent authenticity by the simple passage of time. Perfection, maintained across decades, exacts its toll. The Bedford estate required an army of invisible labor, groundskeepers, housekeepers, stable hands, personal assistants, each trained to understand that their work must never be apparent. The illusion demanded that everything appear effortless, as though the property maintained itself through some aristocratic magic unavailable to ordinary homes. Leaves were raked before they accumulated. Flowers were replaced before they wilted. The performance never paused. Those who worked for the Laurens spoke, when they spoke at all, of exacting standards. Nothing escaped notice. A painting hung at an incorrect angle would be identified and corrected. A vase placed 3 inches from its designated position would be moved. The attention to detail that had built an empire applied equally to the private sphere, transforming domestic life into a continuous exercise in curation. Whether this represented dedication or compulsion depended largely on perspective. The fashion industry watched Ralph Lauren with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. He had broken every rule. He was not European. He had not trained in the traditional ateliers. He showed little interest in the avant-garde provocations that defined high fashion discourse. Yet he had built something none of his critics could dismiss. A business worth billions, a name recognized globally, an aesthetic so pervasive that it had become invisible, absorbed into the general vocabulary of American style. His competitors tried to understand the formula. Some concluded it was simply marketing genius, the transformation of mundane products into aspirational objects through clever imagery. Others pointed to timing, the alignment of Lauren's vision with a cultural moment hungry for traditional reassurance. A few suggested something darker, that he had exploited class anxiety, selling status symbols to those desperate to escape their origins. None of these explanations proved entirely satisfying. The phenomenon exceeded its possible causes. What his critics missed, perhaps, was the sincerity of the obsession. Ralph Lauren was not performing a role for commercial advantage. He had become the role. The distinction between strategy and identity had collapsed so completely that the question of authenticity, so troubling to outside observers, simply did not arise within his experience. He lived in beautiful rooms because he could not imagine living otherwise. He wore impeccable clothing because any alternative was unthinkable. The performance had become autonomic, as natural as breathing. Bedford reflected this totality. The estate was not a retreat from the brand, but its ultimate expression, a place where the commercial justification fell away and only the pure vision remained. Here, Lauren could walk through landscapes he had imagined before he possessed the means to create them. Here, the boy from the Bronx had finally arrived at the destination glimpsed in those childhood films, those magazine photographs studied with such desperate attention. But arrival brings its own complications. The striving that had propelled Lauren from tenement to estate. What happens when it achieves its object? The hunger that had driven decades of creation. What replaces it when the feast is complete? These questions, never articulated publicly, may have haunted the immaculate rooms of Bedford, the silence between perfectly arranged objects. The 2000s brought new challenges. Fashion moved faster now, driven by social media and fast fashion, by consumers who demanded novelty at accelerating rates. The Ralph Lauren aesthetic, rooted in tradition, in the slow accumulation of quality, in the very opposite of disposability, seemed increasingly anachronistic. Young shoppers gravitated toward brands that promised disruption rather than continuity, innovation rather than heritage. The company responded with strategic adjustments. New lines targeted younger demographics. Prices were tiered to capture broader markets. The brand extended into territories, athletic wear, contemporary casual, that would have seemed foreign to its original vision. Whether these adaptations represented evolution or dilution remained a matter of debate within the industry. Lauren himself stepped back from daily operations, though he retained creative control and final authority over matters of taste. His son David assumed greater responsibility, preparing for the transition that mortality would eventually require. The patriarch remained present, his white hair and weathered face appearing at fashion shows and corporate events, a living symbol of the continuity the brand promised. At Bedford, time moved differently. The seasons changed, the horses aged and were replaced, the gardens bloomed and faded according to ancient rhythms. The estate existed outside the accelerations that troubled the commercial world, a preserved space where the 19th century fantasy could continue undisturbed. Staff members who had worked there for decades knew every preference, every routine, every unspoken expectation. The machine ran smoothly, invisibly, perfectly. And in the evenings, when the light turned golden and the fields glowed with that particular Westchester beauty, Ralph Lauren could stand at his window and survey a kingdom entirely of his own invention, purchased acre by acre, constructed detail by detail, maintained through the relentless application of will and wealth. Whatever it was his. That much at least remained beyond question. The collectors began to notice something strange about Ralph Lauren's possessions. Unlike most wealthy accumulators, who hired advisors and followed auction house recommendations, Lauren selected every object personally. His collections, the automobiles, the Western artifacts, the antique furniture, did not conform to established categories of connoisseurship. They followed a private logic, an aesthetic coherence visible only to him. The car collection illustrated this peculiarity most clearly. Other wealthy collectors pursued specific markers or eras, building archives that could be catalogued and compared. Lauren accumulated vehicles that shared no obvious connection except their visual appeal to his particular eye. A 1938 Bugatti beside a 1964 Ferrari, beside a 1950 Mercedes-Benz. The museum world found this approach puzzling. It resisted classification. It could not be studied using conventional methods. But perhaps that was precisely the point. Ralph Lauren had spent his career resisting classification. He was not a fashion designer in the European sense, not an American sportswear manufacturer in the traditional mold. He had invented a category for himself, and his collections extended this invention into material form. The objects existed as evidence of taste, not as investments or historical artifacts. They were beautiful because he found them beautiful. No further justification was required. Bedford housed many of these treasures, though the collections had grown beyond any single property's capacity. Climate-controlled facilities stored automobiles. Warehouses contained furniture and artifacts, awaiting rotation into active display. The accumulation had become its own enterprise, requiring staff dedicated solely to its management and preservation. The boy who once could afford nothing now possessed more than could be seen in a lifetime of looking. The philanthropy followed patterns consistent with the personal mythology. Lauren donated to causes associated with American heritage, with cancer research following his own health scare, with institutions that preserved the traditional values his brand embodied. The Smithsonian received gifts. Historic preservation organizations benefited from his generosity. Each donation reinforced the narrative of a man devoted to continuity, to the maintenance of standards in an era of dissolution. Yet questions persisted beneath the polished surface. Former employees occasionally surfaced with accounts of demanding work environments, of standards impossible to meet, of the human cost extracted by perfectionism. These stories never cohered into scandal. The Laurens maintained too much control over their public image for that, but they suggested complexities invisible in the official narrative. Every kingdom casts shadows. The family itself remained opaque. Decades of marriage, 3 children raised to adulthood, grandchildren now appearing in the generational progression. All of this occurred behind walls that permitted no genuine access. Interviews revealed only what the Laurens wished to reveal. The private life remained private, which in an age of compulsive exposure constituted its own kind of statement. What did they discuss at those Bedford dinners? The table set with antique silver, the rooms arranged with museum precision. Did they speak of the Bronx, of Frank the house painter, of the journey that had brought them to these manicured acres? Or had that history been so thoroughly transcended that it no longer required acknowledgement? The silence surrounding such questions was itself eloquent. The brand continued its global expansion. Stores opened in cities that had never heard of Bedford, that had no connection to the Anglo-American traditions Lauren had spent his life celebrating. Chinese consumers purchased polo shirts. Russian oligarchs decorated homes with Ralph Lauren furnishings. The fantasy had become universal, detached from its specific cultural origins, available to anyone with sufficient funds. This universality represented both triumph and dissolution. The aesthetic that had once signified a particular American dream, specific, rooted, tied to actual places and histories, now floated free of any anchor. It had become pure style, applicable anywhere, meaningful everywhere and nowhere. Whether this expansion honored the original vision or betrayed it depended on assumptions about what that vision had always been. At Bedford, such questions did not intrude. The estate remained fixed in its achieved perfection, immune to the market fluctuations and cultural shifts that troubled the commercial enterprise. Here, the fantasy maintained its integrity, preserved like a specimen in amber. The seasons turned, the staff performed their invisible labors, and Ralph Lauren continued to inhabit the world he had built, a world so complete, so persuasive, that it had long since ceased to require any reality beyond itself. The late afternoon light fell across fields that had been groomed to appear ungroomed. Horses grazed in arrangements that seemed accidental, but were not. And somewhere in the main house, surrounded by objects chosen across a lifetime of looking, the creator of all this considered what would remain when he was gone. The estate endures. The man who built it has entered his 9th decade, still appearing at events with the distinguished bearing his brand has always promised, still maintaining the standards that transformed a Bronx dreamer into an American institution. The white hair, the weathered face, the impeccable clothing, he has become indistinguishable from the mythology he created. Time has granted what invention alone could not, the appearance of authenticity conferred by age itself. Bedford remains as it was designed to remain, preserved against the erosions that trouble lesser properties. The staff continues its invisible maintenance. The horses still graze in fields, arranged to suggest centuries of pastoral tradition. Visitors who receive the rare invitation still depart uncertain whether they have witnessed a home or a museum, a life or a performance. The ambiguity was always intentional. The company has passed through transitions. Leadership has shifted to new generations, to executives who did not share the original vision but inherited its commercial value. The brand persists, though observers debate whether it retains the coherence that once distinguished it. Polo shirts still sell in quantities that would have astonished the young man who began with neckties. The polo player logo still signifies aspiration in markets across the globe. But something has changed, or perhaps merely completed its long evolution. The fantasy Ralph Lauren sold, that particular dream of American aristocracy, of heritage available for purchase, of transformation through taste, has been so thoroughly absorbed into the culture that it no longer registers as fantasy at all. It has become simply how things are, one option among many in the marketplace of identities. The revolution succeeded so completely that it erased the memory of what it replaced. At Bedford, none of this matters. The estate exists outside such considerations, a preserved world where the questions that trouble critics and scholars find no purchase. Here, there is only beauty, maintained at whatever cost beauty requires. Here, there is only the accumulation of decades, objects and arrangements